Good afternoon, everybody. This is Nick from the Berea Public Library, and I'm very excited to be speaking with the local author, Alix E. Harrow.
Thank you so much for having me.
Alix has won a Hugo Award for her short fiction, and her work has been nominated for a Nebula and World Fantasy Award. Her debut novel, The 10,000 Doors of January, came out last year to critical acclaim, and her second novel, The Once and Future Witches, came out earlier October. She's a full-time writer living in Berea with her children and husband. And full disclosure, that's me. I assure you our personal relationship will not affect this interview in any way. I'll be asking extremely tough questions. So let's start off. What's the Once and Future Witches book about?
I was told these were going to be easy questions. You said softballs. Okay, so I sold this book on a 3-word pitch. Suffragettes, but witches, which sounded really easy, but it turns out there's like a huge difference between a pitch for a novel and writing an actual novel. I don't know if you're familiar with that process yet. So the actual book is about 3 sisters in an alternate American history who are part of the women's movement and who are turning the women's movement into a witches movement.
Very cool. What was your original inspiration for this idea?
Yeah, I think it came to me in a dream or something.
Really?
Yeah, well, so I wrote this short story about librarian witches, and then my husband was like, you should do other things witches, like, you know, like activist witches or like the women's movement witches. And like maybe I stole that idea or something. I mean, like maybe.
Amazing.
Yeah, right?
I heard somewhere that you went through more than one draft of this book. How did it change through those drafts?
You heard that somewhere? You read that
Yeah,
somewhere? So, second books are kind of like famously hard to write because like your first book, you're just like on this little fun adventure and you don't know if it's going to go anywhere. And your second book, you have like a deadline and readers to disappoint and an editor to disappoint, and like tensions are high. I think I handled the stress like really well, as you'll remember.
Yes.
I think I was really put together that whole year. So the first like third of it I rewrote maybe like 3 times, which is really reasonable, and then I wrote a whole first draft and I was really like nervous about it. I wasn't super confident, and I handed it in to my editor, and I was hoping it was just nerves, you know. I was like, maybe it's really good and I just can't tell. And then my editor sent me back a 12-page single-spaced edit letter, which I think I greeted very reasonably.
Yes,
If you remember,
I do.
I think I just like laid on the floor and cried for a week, and then when that was done, I rewrote the entire thing in about 3 months, which didn't add really any stress to our household. I think it was fine.
Easy
It
peasy.
was fine.
All right, your short story, A Witch's Guide to Escape, is about librarian witches, and we're here sitting in the library garden. And so how have libraries inspired your work?
So it's really pretentious to talk about like themes in your own writing, but like one of the things that keeps coming up is like the importance of stories and stories as a means of escape, and a really easy available visual metaphor for like stories in a place where they're all gathered and collected as libraries. So they keep coming up in my work. And this library in particular is the first library where I had my own public library card that wasn't my mom's. I got it when I was 17. When I came to Berea, I still have the original rainbow-colored card that I got. And this reading garden is where most of the Once and Future Witches was written. So they've helped me metaphorically and very practically, I would say.
And so, was it hard to write this book when you have 2 kids at home? And how did you manage to balance that work and parenting at the same time?
Yeah, thanks for asking. It was, you know what, people think it's hard, but I found it was like really easy. Because like if you just give the kids to your partner or spouse and then like close the door and you get to work and then they raise the kids and do like most of the cooking and cleaning, I think it works out really
That works
well.
out?
It wasn't, yeah, it
Okay.
wasn't that challenging.
Easy. Okay, now I'm going to move on to some audience
Actually,
questions.
I brought questions for you. Are you prepared for this?
Not how it works, but
It is, I mean, like, I know you didn't like this idea, but I like this idea, so we're doing this. My first question is, while this book was written, you were the primary caregiver for a 2-year-old and a newborn. Why don't you talk about how easy that was?
Oh, a breeze.
It was
Yeah.
right? That's what I thought.
Newborns are historically very easy.
Yeah, everybody knows that.
Yep. Yeah, and I would just recommend, if you do this, just don't get a lot of sleep, because it just goes right by in a blur.
Right,
Yeah.
and then you don't remember.
Yes.
And that's, yeah, okay.
Key.
My second question, hold on. What advice do you have for people whose partners are trying to write novels?
Boundless love and support all the time. Bring them lots of coffee, and flowers. Grow a lot of flowers for them.
Good work.
That's
Good
about
work.
it, I think. I think that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. My last question for you. You had this enormous privilege of reading the same book like 5 or 6 or maybe 7 times by the time it was over. You got to read the same chapters over and over again. How great was that?
I mean, gets better every time,
Every
is what I
time,
would
right?
say.
You're so lucky.
It's amazing. My favorite part, personally, was changing the names each time.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like I would be offended if you got the names
Yeah.
wrong later.
Yes.
Like, I was fine with it.
I still have trouble.
You can read it again.
I know that. I will. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, here's some audience questions for people who put on questions on Instagram and Facebook for you. And the first one is, what was your favorite fairy tale to retell?
Oh yeah, so there's like fairy tales, retellings of fairy tales throughout that book because I indulged myself and I was allowed to. And my favorite one, I think, to mess with was Sleeping Beauty, because it's like the worst fairy tale. I mean, it's not the worst, there's worse ones, but like it's one where the main central female figure has like so little agency. Like in the Disney adaptation of that one, every other character, including the 3 fairies and the prince, has more speaking lines than the central Sleeping Beauty figure. So it was the most fun to like rework it in maybe a feminist lens and put the emphasis on the witchcraft rather than the helpless princess.
Cool. Next one is, how much historical information and references did you feel was necessary to create a period piece while still crafting a magical story?
So I have a background in history. I have my master's degree in history, and I thought that this was going to be a really historically grounded book. And so I spent a lot of time researching the history of witchcraft and the history of women's suffrage, and it turns out both of those things are A, huge bummers, and B, really big. Like the women's suffrage movement is like at least 2 centuries and at least 2 continents worth of movements who were often fighting with each other. They ranged from like teetotalers to abolitionists and genuine radicals, and I couldn't find a piece of that movement that was novel size, that didn't just feel tiny and silly, you know? Like it would be very easy to end up writing about like, well, one summer these women were advocating for an ordinance change in the city of Washington, D.C. that would have, and that's like, the stakes were very low and it was complex and it didn't really hint at the broader movement. So what I did was throw out all of actual history and give myself permission to invent my own timeline. And so I set it in the fictional city of New Salem, and I put whatever I wanted, like the Pullman strike is in there, and the National Women's Party is in there, and the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire is all in the same year, even though none of that happened in the same year, because I wanted to play with it.
Cool. So how has living in Kentucky influenced your writing?
So when I first started writing, there would be like little bits of Kentucky in my stories, and I was like, I'm not going to be one of those like freaky writers who gets obsessed with one place. Like, I'm not going to be Stephen King with Maine, where it's like every time there's a creepy little ghostly New England town. But so far, everything I've written has had a little bit more Kentucky in it. And it's not just like the setting. I feel like it's kind of influenced like the way I tell stories. Like there's a particular sort of oral Southern tradition of storytelling where the narrator just kind of lays it out flat for you, and it's like what had happened was, and then they tell the story.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like there's a narrator-heavy telling versus showing kind of way that I like to write that's from Kentucky.
This next one is, do you get inspired by reading or doing other things like cooking or gardening? Basically, my question is, what makes your books so immersive? When I read your books, I get this sense of the beauty of life.
Oh, that's so sweet. So I think, and this is, everybody's writing process is different, but I definitely feel like you want to have a large proportion of living to writing, like in your ratio of your existence, because I like living, and I want that feeling to be in the books. So I spend a lot of time, like, I don't do the cooking and gardening, but I like watching my husband do the cooking, and I like watching my husband weed the garden. I think that's very therapeutic.
Good, yes.
Yeah, it's really nice. And I hang out with my kids a lot. I actually recently ran across this E.B. White quote where he says, "All I'm ever trying to say with my books is that I love the world." And that's really cheesy, but I think it's kind of true.
So your writing process, what does it look like? Do you outline the whole book first, or do you just start writing and go from there?
As you might know, I outline heavily. I do a lot of bullet lists, and then it gets more and more elaborate, and I break down the whole book by chapter and then by scene, and I've got my characters outlined. I've got like all this information before I start writing. And you get to read the outlines, and I think that's really fun because it's like more fun than reading a book because it makes less sense, right? That's a privilege that you have. And then I start writing, and usually that's completely wrong, is generally how that goes. And then I get to make a new outline for my next draft, and then usually one more outline for my revisions. It's not a very clean process. I feel like there's often people who believe in like outlining or people who write by the seat of their pants. And I think really the only difference between the two is that the outliners think that they know where they're going. And they're mostly wrong.
Yeah, how closely does yours follow the original outline?
If you looked at the original outline for this novel, it's almost unrecognizable.
Oh, really?
The beginning point and the end point are the only things that stayed the same.
So you mentioned an upcoming project featuring fairy tale characters in a Spider-Verse situation. Is that still on the horizon?
Yeah, you remember that we saw Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, a perfect and flawless film that should be studied in writing schools. And we left, and I was like, I want a Spider-Verse, a fairy tale. And then so an editor for a novella series for Tor.com at one point was like, hey, if you ever have a novella idea, like, let me know. And I was like, I want a Spider-Verse, a fairy tale. And he let me. So I mentioned Sleeping Beauty before, and I got to Spider-Verse, a Sleeping Beauty story. So it's where all these Sleeping Beauties from the different versions of the retellings of that story kind of like collide together in the same story and try to like break out of their narrative bounds. And it was really, really fun to write, and it's coming out next in 2021 from Tor.com.
Awesome. And finally, we have a lightning round of questions.
I'm ready. Are there points?
Always.
Excellent.
You prepared? So, from your new book, do you have a favorite of the three sisters?
No. Juniper. Juniper.
Will there be a sequel to 10,000 Doors of January?
No.
No. Favorite superhero movie?
Thor Ragnarok. Black Panther. I'm changing it. Black Panther.
Really?
Yeah.
Favorite season?
Fall. Summer. Like maybe spring.
Not
Am I losing
not
points?
winter.
Okay.
Best pie?
Lemon curd.
Best Chris?
Pine.
And what are you working on now?
If I told you, I'd have to kill you.
Even me?
Even you. There's cameras, honey.
Okay.
Did I win?
You got all the points. All right. Well, thank you so much for making time to talk to all of us today. Thanks to Tay, Christian, Lucas, and April for setting this up and filming. Thanks to Camille for watching our children. And I think this is the closest thing we've had to a date since the pandemic started, so it's great.
Kind of great.
And
Fantastic.
thank you all for joining us, and have a happy Halloween.